And good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Neighbourhood series. Today, we have with us Mr. Talal Rafi, who is an economist and an expert member of the World Economic Forum. He is an economic policy consultant at the Asian Development Bank and a regular columnist for the International Monetary Fund on public finance. He was a member of the Deloitte Global Economist Network, and he's a visiting lecturer at the Center for Banking Studies, Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Talal is an economics fellow at the British think tank, the Oxford Global Society, and was on the board of Sri Lanka's state foreign policy think tank, the Lakshman Kadir Gamar Institute. He has given talks globally, including at the Nasdaq Center, S&P Global, and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and is a regular contributor in thought leadership for the Davos agenda. His work has been published by the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Asian Development Bank, World Economic Forum, London School of Economics, UNFCCC, Chatham House London, Observer Research Foundation, and Forbes. We are delighted to have you join us for this conversation, Talal, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Swati. It's an absolute honor to be on your podcast, and thanks to the Ananta Center for having me.
Thank you. On a lighter note, I am just curious, what else do you have up your sleeve, that we might be missing?
Sure.
Okay. So, before we discuss Sri Lanka, could you share your motivations for your academic journey and interest in the economy?
So, the economy has always been of interest to me because at the end of the day, what I found was this is the area because I've always wanted to have my career on a development path. So that's why I've been involved with the development sector, and the economy is at the core. As you know, even when it comes to studying countries or political processes, so many issues don't take the people that serious to come out and cause revolutions. But the economy is always the cause, whether it's the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. We even saw Sri Lanka in 2022. So like the presidential campaign of Bill Clinton says, it's the economy, stupid. So so that's the most critical thing which can uplift lives. So that's why I've always been interested in this field.
Okay. I am confident that our emerging economist and IR enthusiast will connect with and take valuable insights, from your journey. So thank you once again, Talal, for sharing it with us. And returning to our discussion, I want to highlight Sri Lankan President Anura's 3-day visit, state visit to India, which just concluded on 17th December. He was here from 15th to 17th of December. And this visit was important because both leaders in India and Sri Lanka are, now determined to focus on the future and strengthen their relationship. The JVP, which is, the main party in the ruling National People's Power, has always been critical of India's role in Sri Lanka. In fact, when President Anura, gained political experience, while at the opposition, while he was, leading the opposition, and during his, during his tenure at that point, he really gained that, he gained that advantage while, he was voicing his opinions against India. However, before the Sri Lankan elections on September 21st, the party seems to have changed its stance. President Anura has become more open and willing to work with India. He has, in fact, reached out to businesses, the Tamil minority, and the international community. So, would you like to share your thoughts about this shift and what were the factors that contributed to this shift, in particular?
So that's a good question. The political party that the current president heads has had a long history of not being on the right side of India, to put it mildly. But there has been a shift. So this started probably, I would say, earlier this year in January, when President Anura Kumara Dissanayake, when he was just an MP, was invited to Delhi to visit two other cities as well. And there he met the External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jai Shankar. So I think after that, probably the shift started because the NPP at that point realized that they were seriously in contention to win it, or if not at least be the main opposition force. So that was the sort of understanding where that year the stance shifted. So after coming to power, the reality is that it's a case everywhere. Like when you're in opposition, it's usually you criticize, but then once you come to power, you do the same thing, because in a country like Sri Lanka, where the economy is extremely delicate, there is hardly any space to move. And economy, especially when half of our debt is external debt, and also our economy desperately needs foreign exchange and support from other multilateral organizations where India is influential. It's the foreign policy is always connected to economic policy. So I think a new government, after coming to power, they have realized that, in order for Sri Lanka to move forward, most importantly, relations with India it's an absolute must.
Right. In fact, that's resonance with most of the small states around India at the moment, who have been seeking their support this year and last, we have been seeing it. So thank you for that. And, I would also like to ask you about, India-Sri Lanka relations, that India has played a prominent role, as you have just addressed, in supporting Sri Lanka during its economic crisis. So how do you view the evolving bilateral relations between the two nations, particularly regarding trade, investments, and strategic partnerships?
So I think there's a huge potential going forward. So just to say this, I mean, in 2022, Sri Lanka was in its worst economic crisis. I mean, there was a huge amount due. We had defaulted, but unlike other countries defaulting, we defaulted with less than 20 million US dollars as reserves. So it was a 12-hour power cuts, almost 3 weeks without any fuel, food, medical shortages. So the country was staring at a nightmarish situation. So without India's $4 billion as help, we can't even imagine where we would have been. So as a Sri Lankan, always grateful for the support from India. So from that period onwards, India has gained the, how you would say, it's like the dominant position meaning they have come forward, and they didn't just stop at $4 billion of aid in that critical time. India has come forward, especially with the official creditor committee co-chairing it, making the process, debt restructuring process, much faster, especially on the bilateral side, and even influencing the IMF to get us into a program much faster. Otherwise, the delay of the IMF program itself in 2022, early 2023 was causing a lot of issues with the economy. There was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know where we had defaulted, but nothing much to go forward to. And also, as our former foreign minister said, when he went to meet the managing director of the IMF, Christina, she had mentioned that when the Indian foreign finance minister met her at the IMF headquarters, she had spent about 75% of her time speaking on behalf of Sri Lanka. So that's the sort of support India gave. So that has had its positive effects on the Sri Lankan side. And also, just to say, a month ago, I think Maldives also was on the verge of bankruptcy. They would have defaulted if not for India's help. And 2 months ago, India came forward proactively and extended a $1.7 billion credit that was debt that was due to India. So once again, India has saved Sri Lanka from imminent default. So these are the positive messages the Indian government is sending. But as far as relations goes, there's a huge potential because India is Sri Lanka's largest trade partner. And with the ECTA also, there's a positive vibe, especially after the president met the Indian Prime Minister, that there are certain things that would be going forward, like the ECTA. He's open to having more Indian products coming in, and most of the projects which are on hold or slowed are to be fastened. So these are very good positive signs. And also, we have the potential as far as Sri Lanka goes to attract the largest amount of FDI from India. And other things such as energy cooperation, I see potential in those areas. Like, for example, the amount of energy Sri Lanka has, especially offshore wind. These are things which Sri Lanka could even become a net exporter to India in the future if we can get the correct investments, especially from Indian investors, in order to utilize this properly. So the outlook as far as India-Sri Lanka relations goes, I think is looking very good on the positive side, especially with the stance taken by the new NPP government.
Right. Also, Sri Lanka is undergoing economic restructuring. So, could you share your insights on the country's progress in stabilizing its economy post-crisis and how these measures align with broader regional economic trends?
Sure. So as far as Sri Lanka goes, uh, I would say that when you look at other countries which went through a similar crisis in 2022, I mean, they've gone down the slope, like Lebanon, Venezuela. So, but Sri Lanka has, it's almost a miracle that we've transformed so quickly in 2 years. So right now, the economy, though we are definitely not out of the woods and there's a huge challenge coming in 2028 when most of the debt is due, as of now, if I'm just going to give a brief thing on the macro side, inflation from 70% in 2022 has almost hit the negative side. So interest rates are coming down drastically. So the mood in the country is improving. The stock market has hit an all-time high. So there's a lot of positive things going for the economy as a whole. But at the same time, like I mentioned, stability is absolutely fine when it comes to Sri Lanka if Sri Lanka was in a normal state with not such high debt or not in a default state. But unfortunately, with the level Sri Lanka is, I mean, our debt is over 100% of GDP. I think this 3-year gap, by 2028, most of our debt repayments are going to be due. So this is a very, very short, fast closing window of 3 years we have to do the hard reforms. So hard reforms, I mean, one thing is Sri Lanka has an extremely large public sector, 1.5 million people for a population of 22 million, which absorbs in 2022 around 86% of government revenue. Salaries and pensions alone absorbed around 86% of government revenue. So that's one critical area the new government has to do within the 3 years. The other is trade liberalization and facilitation, free trade agreements, joining RCEP, greater integration with India. So we need to focus on the export side. The tradable sector has to grow because all this time Sri Lanka grew after the war ended in 2010, but the non-tradable side grew. So here we need investments from India, but at the same time, we also need to liberalize our trade in order. I mean, most companies would invest so that they can see a niche where they can outsource parts of their supply chain, as 70% of global trade is supplying global value chains. So that's one thing. Land reforms, labor reforms. So it's a very tight, fast closing window for the new government, and they need to make these very, very tough reforms. If not, the country could be going towards a period where we would require another IMF program after 2027 if the proper reforms are not done. And lastly, we also need to look on the fiscal side. I mean, that has to be brought under control because the rollover debt is too high. The gross financing needs is in 2022, it was 34% of GDP. That's almost 1/3 of Sri Lanka's economy is due if you take the interest and capital payments for 1 year, which is Sri Lanka definitely cannot pay and it will default. So obviously we have to get back into the international capital markets. For that, we need to get our fiscal right so that we can get back into the good books of the trading agencies. So to sum it up, I think things are going good, but we need to do the right things before 2028.
Mhm. Okay, I think this was also President Anura's election theme. I mean, this was the theme on which he really fought, right? Like, and when he won, that's what he rejected, the same old faces, the same old parties that have been just hoodwinking, for a very long time. So I think we can expect a transformation in Sri Lanka, under his tenure, and we are all watching, that. So we are looking forward to, what happens, how, like Sri Lanka is able to overcome and like work on it. Moving on to, next question, which is on Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. So I'd like to share that, Sri Lanka is often seen as a bridge between South and Southeast Asia, South Asia and Southeast Asia. So what potential do you see for Sri Lanka to leverage this position, especially regarding ASEAN integration and global trade routes?
So here again, Sri Lanka is in a very good position because we have, being part of South Asia, Sri Lanka has good relationships with all the countries in South Asia. Plus, it's situated, the location is where most of the global
Mhm.
shipping goes to. So with the ASEAN region mostly involved in, with a high focus on trade and trade liberalization, these are two things that Sri Lanka can bridge. Because if you look at the worldwide study of regions, South Asia has the least amount of trade between countries, and ASEAN is one of the highest. So here again, Sri Lanka can be a sort of a bridge to uh, to act as a sort of a regional trade hub to bring the two regions together. The other thing is also transshipments. Sri Lanka is the Colombo port is the busiest as far as transshipment goods are concerned. So this is another area that Sri Lanka could capitalize on. And special economic zones, those are another factor. Especially as I said that a large part of trade is in global value chains. So this is something that, unlike South Asia, the Southeast Asian regions have mastered it. So there, it's mostly, if you look at trade between the countries, it's mostly intra-industry trade within one industry. So, for example, Indonesia would make a product, and within that product, if there is something that could be made a little bit cheaper in Philippines or Vietnam, they would outsource it there and then re-import it here. So that sort of a thing, if Sri Lanka too could be linked, especially with the ECTA and greater economic integration with India, Sri Lanka could become the sort of the perfect hub for this. But as I mentioned, we need the trade liberalization, trade facilitation, free trade agreements, and joining RCEP. All these have to be done very quickly by the new government. Also, what I would say is the digital bridge. There's another potential meaning for data centers. So many ASEAN countries or even the countries on the Gulf side may not be comfortable with having the data centers on the situated in the place of a much larger power. But Sri Lanka could, with the correct international laws and others, could act as a place where data could be stored from other countries. So this is one aspect that Sri Lanka can look into as a hub. And also financial services, like how Dubai or Singapore acts for their region. Sri Lanka could be South Asia's center for financial services and startups. But at the current rate, I don't think so. But there are a lot of reforms that need to be done. Licenses removed, regulations, in order to get this. And with a 2/3 majority, if the new government can really focus fast and do this, especially with the support pledged by the Indian Prime Minister, I think we have a huge potential to sort of be the perfect bridge.
Absolutely. In that regards, I think the 3-day visit in New Delhi was quite significant. And, again, I'd like to circle back to the debt restructuring and international engagement. And I'd like to know, like Sri Lanka's debt restructuring process has been a very critical topic of late. So, could you also shed light on the role of international institutions and key stakeholders in this process and its implications for regional economies?
Sure. So Sri Lanka has been quite an interesting debt restructuring process if you look at it. So one thing is because unlike most other countries like Zambia or others where it's predominantly debt from China or other countries where it's usually China and the ISP holders, here we have a large mix. Like it comes to more than a couple of dozen countries, but largely it's dominated by China, India, and Japan on the bilateral debt. So Sri Lanka is just to make it simpler, three types of debt Sri Lanka owes. One is bilateral debt. That is China would be the largest player. Half of bilateral debt is owed to China. Then comes India and Japan. Then you have the multilateral debt. That is ADB and the World Bank dominate that. So as a principle, ADB debt or World Bank multilateral debt is not negotiated. Not restructured. So here again, that was the sort of issue before China gave in its reassurances. So China was like, if we want to restructure our debt, the multilateral debt also has to be restructured, because the argument they put it was the World Bank, ADB are mostly funded by the US. So it's their money coming in and those are not restructured, but Chinese money is restructured. But the counter argument is always that the World Bank, ADB, and the IMF, especially the IMF, come in and lend to countries that are already in default. So it's extremely risky. So they need to have their AAA ratings in order for them to gain the funds in order to help out countries around the world. So that's one thing. The third thing is the ISP, the International Capital Market, that debt. So here again, what Sri Lanka has done would be an interesting study, is that Sri Lanka's debt restructuring has involved macro-linked bonds, about 2/3, 68%. So this is like the interest payments, those are all adjusted towards how fast Sri Lanka's economic performance. I mean, if Sri Lanka's GDP grows above 11.5% in the next 3 years, we could have a different rate. If it doesn't perform that well, we could get more concessions. That's one thing. And the other thing is also, for a much smaller part, almost around 15% of the debt is in governance-linked bonds as well. So if Sri Lanka makes the necessary governance reforms, like addressing corruption, etc., the bond holders are willing to make a few adjustments. So this topic is extremely crucial because the world is going through a crisis. So I've just written an article for the IMF on this as well. About 54 countries are under debt stress. So this is extremely worrying because when you look at the stats, 48 countries, which are home to over 3 billion people, that's half the world's population, the interest payments itself is more than the education or health budgets. So this is taking up a large portion of fiscal space, especially when the world is facing challenges such as climate change. So health issues, education. I mean, we really need to transform our skills to move into the fourth and fifth industrial revolution. So for that, governments don't have money because large amounts are going into repayments of debt. So this is extremely critical that Sri Lanka gets the right level of restructuring for the debt so that the debt becomes sustainable. And especially if we can regain access to international capital markets by 2028. Otherwise, our rollover debts are too high to sustain without borrowing. Thanks.
Okay. That was quite interesting and quite insightful, I must say. In terms of the emerging economic trends, Sri Lanka's tech and tourism sectors are showing signs of resilience, despite challenges. So do you see these industries as pivotal for the country's economic revival, and how might they redefine their role in the regional economy?
So as far as tourism and tech goes, these are very critical ones. So I'll touch off on the tourism side first. I mean, this is a low-hanging fruit. I mean, any government can really capitalize on it. So here, Sri Lanka has the potential. I mean, Lonely Planet named it the #1 tourist destination in the world. And it's in a spot where anyone coming as part of a cultural tour can include Sri Lanka also. Anyone visiting from the West India. So here, there is great potential. And Indian tourists make a large contribution to Sri Lanka's tourism sector. But at the same time, there is also a critical infrastructure development that are needed, especially if Sri Lanka is going to push the numbers higher. So infrastructure, digital infrastructure, airport capacities. So these areas need critical investment, especially if it can come from Indian companies. So this can especially boost the revenue of the new government. But on the tech side, Sri Lanka has greater potential. With the ECTA showing positive signs after the meeting of the president and the prime minister in Delhi, it might benefit Sri Lanka, especially if there is collaboration on the tech front. I mean, India is an IT hub, especially Bangalore and others. And Sri Lanka has the human capital. Like, for example, large stock exchanges have their backdoor work done in Sri Lanka. So there is human capital potential greatly in Sri Lanka, which could be utilized. And at the same time, agreement on learning from India's UPI and Aadhaar system can benefit Sri Lanka, especially when it comes to one problem Sri Lanka has is very low tax revenue. That was also the main reason why we went into a crisis. Even right now, around 13-14% is one of the lowest in the world, much lower than India. So the problem is that the tax base is low because the tax administration is not up to standard. So with India's help from India in pushing towards a cashless society, we could see significant increase in tax revenues and also improving welfare payments. That's another area because earlier we had welfare scheme called Samurdhi, where 40% of the Samurdhi budget went to administration cost. So only 60% went to the crowd. So it was similar to what was happening during Miss Indira Gandhi's time in India. So here again, once again, if we can get the UPI system or similar, where cash is directly transferred to the people, we could reduce a lot of cost on this point. And also bank lending. Once we have a cashless society where everything is traceable, it's much easier for the banks to lend. And the last thing about the IT sector is that a stat shows that it grows 2.5% larger than when compared to the rest of the things. So that also means creating additional jobs which are dependent on it. And at the same time, youth unemployment can be solved because these are mostly high paying jobs, especially for graduates who are looking for jobs. So I see these two sectors as contributing positively.
Thank you so much. For giving us such a detailed insight and overview of how the emerging economic trends in Sri Lanka can be helpful and beneficial with the support of India. That with that we can conclude the podcast. However, I have one last question because we cannot ignore the China factor, when we discuss anything in Asia. So how will Sri Lanka balance relations between India and China?
So as far as China goes, I think relations with all our counterparts are important. So I've mentioned that with the US is an important player. China is, especially being the largest bilateral relationship. But I've said this on record many times before that priority number one should be relations with India. So we cannot move forward with anything that, especially on the security front, that is not on the good side of India. So other than that, I think Sri Lanka can and to a certain extent has to maintain relations with many other countries. Like, for example, China is the largest bilateral lender. So the relationships have to be taken into consideration, but it is also very vital for Sri Lanka, not only, as I mentioned, of course, priority number one is India, but on the second front, it's not, the way I see it is not always India or China, but also the US or China. So with India, number one, I think the secondary relationship is also very important to balance it with the other power, especially with the United States being a very important board member of the IMF, on whose program we are. And most of the, the bond laws also coming out of New York and London. So at this moment, it'll be very, very interesting and something to watch out for how the new president deals with China when he next visits Beijing. So he's got a very warm reception here. So we'll have to wait and see.
Absolutely. We are eagerly looking forward to that as well. So thank you once again, Talal, for taking out time and delving deeply into all of these questions, from the bilateral relation between India, the debt restructuring, the economic crisis, addressing all of that. And as we conclude our discussion on the economic ties, between India and Sri Lanka, it's clear that collaboration holds greater potential for both nations. Ending the year on a very good note, and we are hopeful that 2025, brings even more opportunities for, both the countries to really navigate, their economic futures together. So
Yes.
thank you once again. Yes, please.
Thank you, Swati. Thanks a lot for having me. And yes, the new year will bring prosperity to both countries and greater relationship.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.